In 1921, the Louisiana Constitution made English the default for schooling. In 1950, my grandmother lost her language. Because of the risk of being physically and socially punished, her parents refused to continue teaching her or allowing her to speak in French. This wasn't a unique case. Families across Louisiana were told that speaking English would give their children better jobs, a better future, and a place in a changing country. After the death of her French-speaking grandmother, she lost her ability to communicate and lost a tie to her home. A young girl who was once fluent in her heritage could later in life barely understand what was spoken and could not speak in French at all. Instead of being a connection to her ancestors, it became a symbolness of backwardness and poverty. In 30 years, Louisiana didn't just lose a language, it lost its culture. It changed what was passed down, what was valued, and even how people viewed their own identity. If language can shape identity, community, and policy at the local level, then how much greater does it influence global dialogue? In a world where intercultural communication is not just necessary, but foundational to daily life, how can people from different backgrounds speak to one another fairly? Throughout history, people groups have developed or improvised bridges to overcome the barriers of language that arose due to trade or migration. These bridges, called auxiliary languages, are languages used for communication between peoples that do not understand each other's native language. After relying on simplified or combined natural languages as tools for communication, the influence of certain cultures raised a fundamental question. Can any language serve as a neutral medium for global communication? This led to the idea of a constructed auxiliary language, one with a deliberately neutral, accessible, and fair design. Constructed languages are languages whose rules and vocabulary have been artificially invented and are often created for a specific purpose. L.L. Zamenhof created the most popular constructed language in 1899 called Esperanto, but constructed languages have been documented since the 12th century. Esther Shore writes, quote, Zamenhof grew up convinced that linguistic difference lay at the root of interethnic animosity, and before he was out of his teens, he had set out to fashion an auxiliary language. He had already rejected the idea of reviving Greek or Latin, convinced that a truly international language had to be neutral, non-ethnic, and non-imperial. In other words, a language that did not yet exist. Language is foundational to politics today, and international organizations choose linguistic policies based on political priorities, history, and structure. But these policies reveal deeper fractures in the system. Who gets to speak? Who must translate? Whose language carries authority? The European Union uses many languages, promoting representation and respect at the cost of complexity, time, and expense. The Union of Southeast Asian Nations relies on a single language, increasing efficiency while risking inequality for those without access to language education and reinforcing cultural bias and hierarchy. International organizations seek justice, not tradition or domination. A just system gives every nation an equal chance to speak, contribute, and influence outcomes. It reflects a responsibility to treat others with fairness and honesty. At the same time, any system must also be functional and realistic. Even the most just solution is useless if it cannot actually work in practice. Together, the best form of communication in international relations is the fairest one, while still being functional, efficient, and viable. A commitment to justice and international relations not only enhances communication, but also contributes to global stability and peace. Using a constructed auxiliary language offers an alternative to current policies, a neutral and functional language that neither ignores nor dominates the conversation encouraged. The first issue of today is that no efficient international communication is achieved through natural languages. Native speakers hold an advantage, while non-native speakers, often from poorer nations that lack educational infrastructure, struggle to keep up. Even among native speakers of dominant languages, frequently switching between languages slows thinking, delays responses, and increases the risk of misunderstanding. Representatives constantly navigate translation, interpretation, and code switching, which drags down negotiations and clouds meaning. Translation itself cannot fully solve this problem. While it may appear to expand access, it instead introduces confusion, delay, and discontinuity of meaning. In John 1:1, the Greek word logos is commonly translated simply to word, despite the original concept including ideas of reason, order, and discourse. The Lexham Bible Dictionary even goes as far to say that it is, quote, a concept word in the Bible symbolic of the nature and function of Jesus Christ. It is also used to refer to the revelation of God in the world, not simply an utterance as the translation may suggest. Translations, both live and documented, have been controversial for decades because of differences between different language versions. Even the United Nations acknowledges this problem, saying that documents, quote, written in a language other than the mother tongue of its drafter increases the possibility of ambiguity. If the award were too ambiguous, it might be difficult to enforce it. Furthermore, relying on translation is not only inefficient, but can be exploited. The Treaty of Waitangi, one of New Zealand's founding documents, has been historically controversial because of inconsistencies between the English and Maori versions, which were used to justify seized land, breached policies, removed power in legislation, and issues with funding. A shared language does more than speed communication. It strengthens clarity, comprehension, and accuracy. Access to translation also varies widely. Many nations lack financial resources to pay for translation, meaning that their voices are missing from important discussions. Hosting the UN can enhance a country's visibility, credibility, and status in international relations. However, without translation capacity, it is impossible for them to do so. This structural inequality means that language barriers are not just logistical, they are political. If the UN were ever to expand its permanent council, these drawbacks would prevent certain countries from joining, removing any chance of veto power. Nations without the economic means to pay for translation lose opportunities to shape global policy. Even within the largest and most resource-rich organizations, translation services are inconsistent and costly. In the 1997 to 1998 fiscal year, the United Nations was unable to meet 19% of translation and interpretation services requested. The next issue is that international affairs are not truly international under the current system. Anthea Roberts writes that, quote, many international courts employ two working languages, English and French. This policy plays a significant role in determining which international lawyers are likely to be selected as judges, arbitrators, advocates, and staff. Language becomes an important filter for which nationals, and thus which national approaches, gain greater access to influencing the international. Language policies affect the power structures in international organizations. According to a recent study published in Language and Intercultural Communication, language bias affects communication on a personal and institutional level. Speakers of dominant languages gain easier influence in scholastic settings regardless of their actual expertise. This reveals a serious flaw with power following language rather than knowledge or truth. Non-native speakers must work harder to express complex ideas and still risk being misunderstood. A constructed auxiliary language is the fairest and most functional form of communication because it is not attached to any specific culture or people group. Its neutrality removes the political and cultural baggage that makes natural languages unequal. In a world where language defines power, the communication we choose determines who is heard and who is silenced, whether peace is settled or war is waged. The current system, built on translation and dominant languages, reinforces inequality by favoring nations with greater resources and influence. A constructed auxiliary language offers a fair and functional alternative, removing built-in hierarchies, reducing dependence on costly translation, and creating equal conditions for participation. In international relations, where equity and cooperation are essential, communication must reflect those same values. Despite these benefits, there is still considerable hesitancy to adopt a constructed language in international affairs. Opposition claims that nations will naturally prefer their own languages. While this holds true in some cases, such as France insisting that all UN Secretaries General speak fluent French, history shows broader support for a shared international language. In 1945, the League of Nations gave serious consideration to adopting Esperanto as the official language, and support came from across the world. Iran proposed it, Japan presented evidence in its favor, and Britain produced a petition signed by over 2,000 high-profile supporters. Different delegates, countries, and cultures all reached the same conclusion. A neutral language could benefit everyone more fairly. The most common objection, however, claims that a constructed language lacks realism or practicality. It simply isn't a viable option. However, this argument does not hold strong ground. As mentioned, the League of Nations considered Esperanto, and the proposal gained broad support. Its lack of implementation was because of a veto from France, whose opposition stemmed largely from concerns over the diminished influence of French, rather than from worries of Esperanto's functionality. This moment, instead of supporting the idea of impracticality, instead reveals how strongly nations tie language to power and further emphasizes why neutrality matters. Constructed languages already function in highly specialized settings. The International Academy of Science, San Marino, explicitly employs Esperanto to minimize cultural and linguistic bias in scientific discourse. Students write theses in both Esperanto and a second language, and research papers are often produced bilingually to reduce the influence of language on reasoning and logic. For an example in politics, modern Standard Arabic is spoken by over 355 million people and is used in literature, academia, print, mass media, religion, and law and legislation throughout the Middle East. However, a little-known fact is that there are no native speakers. Instead, it is a semi-constructed language learned as a standardized version of Arabic to compensate for and provide a writing system to the 30-plus dialects of Arabic that exist. Through this system, regions throughout the Arab League can communicate with one another, proving the viability of an auxiliary language in realistic political situations. These practices show that constructed auxiliary languages serve not just as ideals, but as practical tools for fairness and clarity. One of the strongest advantages of a constructed language lies in their design. Natural languages evolve and accumulate irregularities and ambiguities, such as the English to be verb. Be, is, was, and has been are all different and all correct. Some have the idea of forcing regularity onto natural languages, but this always has negative effects. In the 1920s, Turkish President Mustafa Kemal Ataturk created and replaced over 100,000 words in a short period of time. Currently, as English speakers, we can read Shakespeare or even Beowulf and understand the content. But imagine if you couldn't even comprehend The Great Gatsby. Today, Turks cannot read most text from before the 1930s unless they are translated into modern Turkish because of this forced regularity. Constructed languages, by contrast, inherently follow consistent and intentional rules, making them easier to learn and use. This supports the earlier goal of balancing fairness with efficiency. Instead of giving native speakers an advantage, they place all learners on equal ground and allow a unique specialization that can create a better system. In 1921, the Louisiana Constitution made English the default for schooling. In 1968, the state created the Council for the Development of French in Louisiana to try and reverse this damage. Language loss is not simply a shift in vocabulary or a necessary evil of efficiency, but the erosion of tradition and identity. The suppression of Cajun French severed generations from their culture, replacing a living language with silence and stigma. Today, revitalization efforts attempt to recover what was nearly erased, but the effects still reveal how fragile culture comes when language is subordinated to power. Linguistic inequality has consistently reduced societies to becoming outsiders within a system that is supposed to be for the common good. A constructed auxiliary language offers a different path forward, one where global communication no longer requires the sacrifice of local identity or the preservation of bias. Removing dominance from international discourse allows cultures to preserve their languages rather than abandon them, ensuring that participation in international affairs does not come at the cost of cultural survival. The most persuasive part of a constructed language is its capacity for deliberate structure. A constructed diplomatic language could incorporate markers for evidence, intent, or certainty, thereby reducing the potential for manipulation or misunderstanding, and fulfilling the goal of justice in all areas. In 2002, former President George Bush said that, quote, "The British government has learned that Saddam Hussein recently sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa." These simple 16 words justified a war to Congress and the public. However, the use of the word learned implied to many certainty, when in fact only suspicion existed. This example shows how language shapes deliberation and is the foundation of global events. If we were to switch to a constructed language, linguistic markers, such as those in the constructed language of Ladon, could indicate whether a statement is declarative and how information was learned, personally by the speaker, from a trusted source, from an untrusted source, hypothetical, or that there are simply facts of the matter and the validity of their truth is not known. Hyper-specific trade terms could be created and conveyed more accurately and quickly in speeches and deliberations, supporting efficiency and clarity in communication. A constructed language can fulfill any goal of international communication because of this capacity for deliberate structure. Reducing misunderstanding does not just improve speech, it protects lives and resources. Clear language could prevent costly conflict and limit unnecessary loss. In diplomacy, where decisions carry lasting consequences, precision matters. This capacity for deliberate structure makes constructed languages uniquely suited to the goals of international diplomacy. A constructed auxiliary language provides a fairer and more functional platform for communication in international affairs because it mitigates the bias inherent in natural languages, removes the cognitive advantage of native speakers, and ensures that ideas are transferred more accurately. It lowers costs, prevents reliance on translation, and preserves cultural identity without domination. International relations are meant to achieve peace and stability for the greatest number of people possible. A flawed, unjust, and unfair system can never achieve these ideals. Since language is foundational, we must fix the fractures that exist in linguistic policies before any other issue, whether it be trade, resources, or even peace, can be discussed. If we're to truly value efficiency, accuracy, and justice, using a constructed auxiliary language is the only path forward. Thank you.
Efficiency throughout your speech. That term typically refers to outcomes that minimize overall cost, typically measured in money, or that maximize overall output, typically measured in goods or money. Is this the definition of efficiency you want your audience to apply to your argument?
Thank you for your question. May I refer to my notes?
Yes.
As you mentioned, most people think of efficiency as being measured through cost, quantities, or physical products. I've already spoken about the logistical problems with translation services, but the view of efficiency that I am using in this argument is more about accurate comprehension and easy, quick transfer of information. As I mentioned briefly, frequent language switching slows down mental processes, which then slows negotiations and increases the chance of misinterpretation. Conversely, research demonstrates that speakers of constructed languages, such as Esperanto, have fewer misunderstandings and quicker comprehension than when translating from natural languages. And also, I believe just common sense, going consistently from one language to one language is much more efficient in any sense than going from multiple to multiple, which is what the current system supports. So my view of efficiency is that communication can be considered efficient when it results in shared understanding without distortion or loss.
Okay, so with that definition, if the UN decides to implement a constructed language like Esperanto, how will it know it's become more efficient? Will it know?
Yes, thank you. I would not say that there is a ultimate standard, or well, there isn't a specific event that international organizations can check off a list. They can say, oh, when we achieve X, Y, Z, now we're perfectly efficient. Instead, it's more of the UN already recognizes that it has problems with its current system. They acknowledge discrepancies in documents, exploitation of discrepancies, that misunderstandings occur, and that translation is costly and slow. International organizations acknowledge all of these problems. So instead, I believe, instead of there being a check mark that they can say, now we're efficient, it's instead, the current system isn't working. Constructed languages, as I believe I've proven, will make a better system, and instead it is a journey to that ultimate standard of efficiency through switching to constructed languages.
Okay. Second question. You're well aware of the statistic. About 20% of the global population already speaks English. So even if there is a language bias, isn't it far more practical and efficient to use a language that a fifth of the world already speaks?
Thank you for your question. May I have a moment to consult my notes? So just for the audience's comprehension, English is an example of a dominant language. And dominant languages are languages that have a large number of speakers, they have large global influence, or they have large institutional support. Just because there's a large number of speakers does not mean that it's necessarily dominant. For example, Hindi has the third most speakers in the world, however, it is not linguistically dominant. English, for example, though, does fulfill all three of these classifications. It has a large number of speakers, it has large global influence, and it has large institutional support. However, the problem with using, even if it is a language that a lot of people speak, is that the biases that I explained earlier in my speech from natural languages, any natural language, dominant or not, still exist. There are still native speakers which they have inherently an advantage through, it could be worldviews, social hierarchies, nuances of meaning, that as much time as you may spend learning the language, native speakers will always have something that non-native speakers do not. And then also supporting these dominant languages just increases resources for those dominant languages, and these smaller languages are just statistically left behind. In international diplomacy or trade, using a natural language like English, French, or Mandarin inherently privileges these native speakers with the cognitive, cultural, and rhetorical advantages. So in deliberations, if an international organization was to use English, native speakers of English would have a rhetorical advantage in every deliberation and discussion, which would mean that they are more likely to get things that privilege their nation, which, as I mentioned earlier, was not the goal of international affairs. It is meant to treat everyone fairly. So because of the biases and the discrepancies presented in natural languages, even if it does have a high number of speakers, it does not ultimately benefit everyone, which is the goal of international justice.
Okay. I'm gonna push that a little bit into the third question, or push you on that a little bit into the third question. Okay, so I know you consulted different definitions of justice. Aristotle's definition is often summarized as treating equals equally and treating unequals unequally. So just to clarify how that applies in this scenario, or in the dominant versus non-dominant language scenario. So in general, America spends more in their military than any of the other top 10 countries that spend money internationally combined. Only our American aircraft carriers patrol oceans. And it was America that emerged as the dominant power after World War II. So in that light, doesn't America have some claim to project culture and language because of this unequal yet dominant way in which we secure international trade, especially in the world?
Yes, thank you for your question. I would agree that yes, I am using a version of justice that aligns with Aristotle's view of justice. He believed it was the complete virtue, so it required the practice of every other virtue. And he had two types of justice, general justice and particular justice. General justice is more of lawfulness, while particular justice deals with fairness, which is the foundation of my case. And then, as you said, it was about fair allocation of resources. However, Aristotle's justice also had responsibilities for the common good. So just because one single nation, such as the United States, may have more resources and they contribute more to the global society, it is also that they have a responsibility to the common good, similar as every other country has a responsibility to the common good. And since we are valuing justice and fairness above all else, that's the framework of my case, is that justice is the ultimate goal. Just because a country does have more power or puts more resources into an organization does not mean that they inherently have the privilege of having their language used.
So, in terms of the common good, is it not the common good for American aircraft carriers to secure international waters? Is that not for the common good?
Will you rephrase your question?
You're correct that the common good was Aristotle's understanding of general justice. Is it for the common good that America dominantly, more so, far more so than any other nation, secures international waters? Is that something that exists for the common good, or is it something that is just meant to secure American dominance?
I'm uncertain of whether or not America's presence in international waters is for the common good. I would assume that protection is for the common good. However, the outlines of my thesis, the boundaries of my thesis are for linguistic policies, which are completely different than military affairs. In military affairs, we can say that certain countries do give and take more. However, with something as foundational and something that should be as equal as language, it's not inherently that there should be a give and take. I believe that justice is still the ultimate goal and that equality is still the ultimate goal of these linguistic policies.
Okay, so that'll come into the final question, which is, what happens when there is a direct conflict between something like national security and international fairness? For example, the major European powers, the EU and the United States, all collectively permit, or do not permit, Iran to stockpile nuclear weapons, yet we have nuclear weapons. So should fairness still remain the priority of international relations when it comes to conflicts with national security?
Thank you for your question. Yes, it should. When national security and international fairness come into conflict, states often do prioritize security, and it becomes even more desperate of a situation when, in the case of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction, I do strongly believe that a nation's first responsibility is to itself and its own safety. However, my argument is that fairness cannot be treated as optional, even in these cases, because it is foundational to achieving justice. So even when security concerns are real, abandoning fairness at a structural level, especially in communication, only deepens inequality and conflict over time. I believe that instead of these two issues being against each other, Instead, national security concerns emerge because the original system was not fair. Dominant countries are allowed to stay dominant, which doesn't check their behavior, and it also poses a threat to smaller countries, which then retaliate and feel that the only way that they could be on equal footing is through drastic means such as military maneuvers. As I mentioned earlier, I'm working from a framework that allows for an ultimate standard of justice. And through this, fairness is not an option or a strategic choice, but it's a moral requirement to fulfill the idea of justice. National security may justify temporary exceptions, however, it cannot replace fairness as the guiding principle. In the long term, fairness is what makes justice and security sustainable, because a system that is unequal will produce instability and conflict. So my position is that security can take precedence in the short term, but under the boundaries of my argument, specifically in linguistic policies, fairness must remain the foundation if the goal of just and stable international order is to be achieved. Thank you.
I know the United States soon has to negotiate with Iran about opening this strait that, when it's blocked, is causing all of our gas prices to increase. Should they conduct those negotiations in Esperanto?
I actually read about this in the paper. Do you mind if I?
You did?
Yeah, do you mind if I go back to that?
No, I do not. I would love to hear about that. I don't think Donald Trump or JDS speak Esperanto.
Yeah. Let's see. Okay, so would you like me to just read it or summarize? This is part of my paper, which you guys should read if you want to. I wrote that other popular arguments, this is during my refutatio section, especially from citizens of dominant countries, express concern over the balance of justice and fairness when national security issues are present. This issue can be addressed with an example of current events: the United States, Iran, and nuclear capabilities. A just outcome in such a negotiation as this would not reflect the strategic dominance of one party, but instead seek to balance the legitimate interests and concerns of both sides. Iran, as a sovereign state, has a recognized right to pursue peaceful nuclear applications, such as research and energy. However, the United States and the broader international community have a responsibility to prevent nuclear proliferation and maintain global security. Regardless of the exact results of this treaty, since Iran and the United States do not share a common tongue, language would play a critical role in determining whether the results can be achieved fairly. If the negotiations were conducted in English, the U.S. would gain an inherent advantage, including rhetorical persuasiveness, framing of terms, or interpretations of statutes. It would be the same if it were deliberated in Farsi or Persian. A constructed auxiliary language, by contrast, would place both parties on equal linguistic footing, reducing the extent to which one side could leverage fluency and bias as negotiation power. In this way, a constructed language would aid in achieving a more just outcome for all parties involved.